The old politics had parties, policies, planks, opposition. The new politics is concerned only with images. The problem in the new politics is to find the right image. So search committees are formed to find the candidates who have the right image. Manhunting has become a great big business, both in the military world and in the commercial world and the political world. Image hunting is the new thing, and policies no longer matter.
Marshall McLuhan, que acabamos de ver e ouvir aqui, diz-nos nesta intervenção do início dos anos 70 que a política tenderá a ver com a imagem. Imagem enquanto projeção de algo que não se é verdadeiramente. Será que ele acertou? Já em 1967, no entanto, o mesmo Marshall McLuhan antecipava que a sala de estar se transformava progressivamente numa assembleia de voto. Pensava sobretudo ele no escrutínio em tempo real das decisões dos políticos que emergiram com a massificação da rádio e da televisão, longe da era dos computadores pessoais e da internet. No mesmo livro em que faz esta antecipação, McLuhan alertava para um conjunto de 7 grandes modificações na interação dos indivíduos. Eu gostava de as passar rapidamente partilhar convosco. A primeira és tu. E em 2006, 40 anos depois, a revista Time elegeu como a figura do ano tu. A tua família. O círculo familiar alargou-se. A espiral de informação que nos rodeia ultrapassa largamente qualquer influência que o papai e a mamã possam exercer. O caráter já não é apenas talhado por estas duas pessoas esforçadas, o pai e a mãe. Todo o mundo contribui. Com as profundas alterações nas dimensões de espaço e tempo, tornámos-nos na aldeia global em que tudo acontece em simultâneo. Com isto alteram-se outros conceitos. Onde moro, onde é a minha casa, onde fica a casa dos meus amigos, quem são os meus vizinhos. A educação. As crianças são submetidas desde o início da vida à informação dos adultos com um bombardeamento permanente, contínuo. A forma, a frequência e o conteúdo deste bombardeamento são, assim, muito contrastantes com o ambiente escolar, muito mais fragmentado, fechado, mas muito mais organizado. As crianças, dizia ele, crescem num absurdo. Vivem entre dois universos que fazem com que a mera educação já não seja mais suficiente. E o que é que vais fazer a seguir quando o circuito e a máquina aprenderem a fazer o teu trabalho? Emprego representa um padrão relativamente recente de trabalho, respondeu à fragmentação e especialização exigidas pelas tecnologias mecânicas entre os séculos XV e XX. A unificação produzida pelos circuitos elétricos e eletrónicos faz com que cada vez mais funções se assemelhem ao ensino, à aprendizagem e aos serviços. O teu governo. O público, enquanto conceito de grandes consensos em redor de pontos de vista distintos, acabou. A sala de estar transforma-se numa cabina de voto. Mas a verdade é que, apesar disso, os políticos têm tendência para dar respostas de ontem aos problemas de hoje. E, por fim, a última dimensão. Os outros. A consciência dos outros, ou seja, como as tecnologias de informação iriam permitir que cada vez mais pessoas que até então se sentiam isoladas ou alienadas do status quo, iriam descobrir, afinal, outras pessoas como elas, tornando impossível aos políticos ignorar a força já não apenas das maiorias, mas também das minorias. A tecnologia é um facto, foi, por exemplo, já se falou aqui, uma ferramenta decisiva na Primavera Árabe. Nações eventualmente mais belicistas, se me é permitido o termo, acreditam também que a tecnologia é igualmente decisiva para remover Estados ditatoriais. Paradoxalmente, alguns desses Estados podem rapidamente cair no oposto, como ficámos a saber com a complexa e controversa questão do Wikileaks, das denúncias sobre a recolha ilegítima e invisível de informação por parte da Agência Nacional de Segurança norte-americana, divulgada por Edward Snowden, que rapidamente a Rússia albergou, um ano antes de anexar a Crimeia e entrar em guerra com a Ucrânia, e a que o Ocidente respondeu com o congelamento de bens e a restrição de circulação de pessoas, de personalidades russas, e congelamento de contas bancárias, etc. Ou seja, a imagem, ouvimos no vídeo inicial, mas realpolitik continua a ser realpolitik. E como é que a tornamos, de facto, mais real? Desde sempre que a tecnologia tem sido apresentada como uma espécie de definitivo, grande e decisivo passo para a democracia plena e permanente. Estaremos a caminho de uma sociedade mais transparente, melhor governada, com maior intervenção do cidadão na gestão do bem comum, e será esse o caminho certo, por mais absurda que pareça a pergunta? Estamos, afinal, mais próximos uns dos outros ou mais afastados do que nunca, separados por tantas pequenas diferenças? Estas perguntas são apenas um ponto de partida para esta sessão, moderada pela Ana Neves, que vai apresentar os oradores, com quem vos deixo. Ana Neves é responsável por um projeto de dinamização, e não só, de participação cívica chamado Cidadania 2.0, que aproveito para convidar a conhecerem um pouco melhor. Ana.
Muito obrigada. Boa tarde a todos. Nós estamos na Casa da Música e eu gostava de começar partilhando convosco uns versos de uma música de Jorge Palma, que diz assim: andamos por aí, sempre a mandar vir, como é que é, entre a cerveja e o café, contestatários inatos, com todo o respeito. We're here to talk in this panel about the digital republic. And what I'm really eager to listen today from these amazing speakers here are their views about where are our digital cafes, where are people talking to each other, discussing the things that really matter. Where do we get our info in order to make informed decisions? We want people to vote, we want to fight the apathy, but are we giving them enough information to make decisions? And on the other hand, do people really want to be engaged? And are they really seeking and actively using the information they're given? To discuss these things, and lots of other exciting ones as well, we have Andrew Chadwick. His Twitter handle, for those who want to tweet about it, is Andrew_Chadwick. He's a professor of political science at Royal Holloway in London. He's researching the role of social media in politics through the new political communication unit, which he founded and now co-directs. His last book, The Hybrid Media System, is a reflection of his most recent work. And Casa da Música, as he told me, is probably the type of stage he craved for when in the late 80s he was part of an indie band. So he is Casa da Música for you. Then we're going to have Francesca Bria. Her Twitter handle, just to make it really easy, it's Francesca_Bria. She's a senior project manager at Nesta and a senior consultant at NASA Innovation Lab. At European Union, she coordinates the Direct Democracy Project, and she advises the European Commission on policy for the Internet of the Future and smart cities. With all these projects, I hope you're still very flexible and bringing back the skills from being a member of the Italian team of gymnastics. Finally, we'll have Mario Campolargo. His Twitter handle is Mario Campolargo. I'm so happy they're all easy. He's a director of Net Futures at DG Connect at European Commission, where he leads the European innovation efforts in promoting innovation and research in the areas of 5G, cloud, and the Internet of Things. He loves everything to do with the civic society, and is very involved in immigrant associations at the moment. So I think it's a pleasure to have the three of them here, and we'll start with Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for that fine introduction. Thank you for bringing up my past as a failed musician. Hello, everyone. My name's Andy Chadwick. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you very much to the Foundation and to Pedro in particular for inviting me. The title of my talk is this: The Digital Republic Didn't Happen, but the News Isn't All Bad. My subtitle is New Communicative Resources for Citizen Engagement. I'm in a glass half full frame of mind at the moment, but not without qualifications, and I'll mention some of those as I go through. I'd like to start with a quotation, it seems fitting, from Marshall McLuhan, and this was from his book Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man in 1964. The content of any medium is always another medium. And that's really where I come at media and politics from, this kind of angle. I'm interested in the interrelationships between older and newer media forms and how they shape politics. And I'd like to start by saying, really, can we try and escape some of the limits of the older debates about digital media and democracy? Since the emergence of the digital democracy movement in the 1990s, most of the arguments in favor of online engagement of one form or another have been quite idealized. They've celebrated a Athenian model, a public sphere model, or in America, a New England town hall deliberative model, as a kind of measure by which we can judge political discourse. Now, this approach has been heavily influenced by a very idealized understanding of how people behave politically, both offline and online. And as a consequence, I would argue, the use of digital network technologies to shape public policy is far too often met with incredulity by most politicians, public officials, journalists, and citizens. And the second problem with the digital democracy paradigm is this: it tends to assume that older media forms, particularly broadcast television, but also even professional journalism, will inevitably be displaced by what are seen as more civically valuable forms of online communication. And there tends to be the assumption that one day, all democratically valuable political activity that involves media will take place online. So old media bad, new media good is the logic. And here are just a few examples of that turn of the century moment, a range of books to do with e-democracy from about between 12 and 15 years ago. And here's a quotation from Dick Morris, who was at one stage very influential in US politics, former advisor to President Bill Clinton. And this is him in 1999. And when I was asked to give this talk and I saw the title, The Digital Republic, it reminded me of what Dick Morris once said, but he called it a chat room republic. And I'll just read this out. It's quite extraordinary. A new political force has emerged, the fifth estate. The fourth estate, print and broadcast media, is going down in flames. Members of the fifth estate, rooted in and legitimized by the internet, speak to one another without being interrupted by pundits, press secretaries, or politicians. The fifth estate is the people, and power is in our hands again for the first time in many decades. We are no longer a nation of viewers and readers. We live in a chat room republic. But I would argue that things were never going to be this simple. Pundits, press secretaries, and politicians, as Dick Morris described them, have moved online, but they have adapted and reasserted their elite power. But at the same time, the news is not all bad for ordinary citizens. I would argue that this is far from the case. But it's a mixed picture. It's a picture of adaptation and institutional and organizational evolution. And I think that's the most realistic picture that we can adopt today. And as Anna said at the start, this is drawn from my latest book, The Hybrid Media System, Politics and Power, available in all good bookshops, by the way, unlike my previous musical recordings. So let me talk you through a few examples, because it's quite a wide-ranging argument. I'm going to skip across some things quite quickly, but my aim today, in what's left, about 16 minutes, is to stimulate thoughts and ideas, and we can follow up the conversation after we've heard from our other two speakers as well, and hopefully it'll make you think a little bit differently. So the argument of the hybrid media system is this. It's clear that political communication is in the middle of a chaotic transition period that's been caused by the rise of digital media. I'm not denying that. But what I've tried to do with this book is develop a way, but it's by no means the only possible way, to explore this transition and explain how I believe power works amid this chaos. So let's try and integrate older and newer media in the study of politics. Let's develop holistic approaches that help us map where the distinctions between older and newer media matter and where those distinctions are dissolving. Let's also examine what I call renewed media, by which I mean older media, like television, for instance, which has adapted and integrated the logics of newer media. And this requires a systemic perspective, not abstract statistical snapshots, but specific illustrations of these things in flow. And I think the key to all of this is some sort of conceptual understanding of power, and one that can be illustrated empirically. So here it is in a nutshell. The hybrid media system is built upon interactions among older and newer media logics, where logics are defined as technologies, genres, norms, behaviors, and organizational forms in the reflexively connected fields of media and politics. Actors in this system are articulated by complex and ever-evolving relationships based upon adaptation, interdependence, and concentrations and diffusions of power. Actors create, tap, or steer information flows in ways that suit their goals and in ways that modify, enable, or disable others' agency across and between a range of different older and newer media settings. And we can see this hybridity in flow, in information consumption and production patterns, in newsmaking and journalism, in parties and election campaigns, in activism, and in government communication. And we can adopt a mix of different researcher methods to study it. Historical analysis, documentary analysis, real-time, live online research, and insider ethnographic methods. I just want to give you a flavor of some examples of what I mean. And I'm going to frame this next part of my talk in terms of how can we understand politically useful information today? It's a fundamental question. And my immediate response is to say that politically useful information is created in a hybrid media system in which older and newer media logics are interdependent. So in this context, civic capacity increasingly rests upon a hybrid mix of different media technology affordances. Big, older media events clearly still matter. This is Barack Obama's now famous acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention at Denver Football Stadium in 2008. 80,000 people were there. But it was also an event that integrated television, it was covered live all day, physical space, and digital media to spectacular effect. real-time, newer media engagement around big, older media events also matters. Here are some statistics from 2011, so 5 years ago now from the United Kingdom, which shows that across all age groups, commenting, using your smartphone or iPad or computer to comment in real time on television shows as they happen was a very widespread practice and is now, certainly in the United Kingdom, is routine. It's embedded for large sections of the population. So even among the age group 45 to 54, in 2011, 44%, and this was a nationally representative opinion poll conducted by a good polling company, YouGov, said that they engage in this practice. But more importantly, what does this mean for politics? Well, we've got a new project underway at Royal Holloway that we've been conducting last year during the European parliamentary elections, the British version thereof, and recently in the 2015 general election from a month ago. And what we found is the hybridity of political broadcast events and social media reconfigures citizens' online and offline engagement. So I'll talk you through this study very briefly. And this is some research I've been doing with my colleagues Christian Vakari and Ben O'Loughlin. So dual screening, the idea of the bundle of different practices associated with using an internet-connected device like a smartphone or a tablet to access social media to find out and discuss live broadcast events is now routine. So what we did was we developed a unique research design which combines large-scale Twitter datasets and custom-built panel surveys of ordinary people, focusing on how precisely they go about interacting with televised party leaders' debates. And party leaders' debates on TV now are big news in Britain. We had our first ones of these in 2010, and in the 2015 election, they well and truly became embedded in the campaign, and they're here to stay. So what we do in this study is we looked, first of all, at the European Union election findings, and we focused on the debate between Nick Clegg, the Liberal Democrat Deputy Prime Minister at the time, and Nigel Farage, the leader of the isolationist anti-EU party, UKIP. But we found some really interesting effects. We weren't looking for party support, per se, and we weren't looking for who won or lost the debate. Those are quite, dare I say it, boring questions. What we were interested in is how people take away their experiences of engaging with the debate via two screens, and how it goes on to affect and shape their subsequent engagement with the campaign. And what we found was that it increases accidental exposure to politics among those who aren't very politically interested. It boosts engagement, particularly among young, educated Twitter users. And the affordances of Twitter, the characteristics of it, such as viewing posts in your timeline, being mentioned by other Twitter users, and encountering hashtags, enhances certain forms of political engagement. And these are long-lasting. They last up to two months in this case of the panel study. And I want to say a little bit about the new types of hybrid forms of television and online activism that are emerging. So I want to start very briefly with the example of what was an EU-wide campaign. Perhaps you've heard of it because it concerns the fisheries industry. And that's Hugh's fish fight against the policy of discards in the European Union, the policy of throwing away healthy fish because they don't meet certain guidelines, even though they've been caught by trawlers. So it's seen by environmentalists as a particularly difficult practice. We're seeing hybrids of television celebrity chefs in this case. He's a cookery and lifestyle writer, but he does a lot of his stuff on television. But he managed to energize an online campaign based around online petitions, and eventually, in the course of just 3 days, went from 30,000 signatories to 500,000, eventually got over 900,000 signatories. And 2 years on, the European Union abolished its policy on fish discards. There was a whole range of different ways in which they highlighted their campaign using a mixture of television and online media. Another example is Jamie Oliver, again another celebrity chef, who has had a long campaign to reform school meals policy and food policy in the public sector in Britain with his Food Revolution campaign. So these are new forms of activism that can only exist in the spaces between and the overlaps among older and newer media forms. They're civically valuable. They're not to be dismissed. They don't map onto parties. They don't map onto traditional organizational forms of politics, but they're important. They energize large numbers of people. Moving on to journalism, elite journalists now have real-time routines. I've got an amazing slide here. Well, I find it amazing. This is the first time I actually saw mainstream elite journalists actually checking their smartphones. This was during the Boston bombings in April 2013. They were checking Twitter live for tip-offs and sources while they were actually live to camera. And now this is not routine, but it's certainly much more widespread than it used to be. This is a slide where the text is very small, but you don't have to read the tweets. What I'm trying to get across here is that this is BBC journalist Laura Kuenssberg in Britain breaking news on Twitter about the so-called Bullygate scandal that surrounded British Prime Minister Gordon Brown in 2010, about which I did a long study. So publics and journalists now interact in real time to shape the news. And again, this is, you don't need to read the tweets and the analysis, but this is part of a slide from that same study, where I show in some detail how certain framings and interpretations and pieces of information that are introduced by ordinary members of the public go on to shape journalists' framings of the event. And in the end, the allegations of bullying inside Number 10 against Gordon Brown completely collapsed within 5 days as a result of this series of interventions. All of the mainstream journalists were just reporting it like it was fact. But these interventions changed that narrative very quickly. Electoral or election campaigns are now hybrid also. Back to the United States. For me, the 2008 US presidential campaign was a decisive period in all of this, the thing that kicked off this idea for me of the hybrid media system. At the time, a lot of writers, a lot of commentators were saying, it's all about the internet. Obama wouldn't have won without the internet in 2008. But I take a rather different perspective. It wasn't about the internet in isolation. It was about how the campaign so ruthlessly integrated online, broadcast, physical space, grassroots activism and elite control, and older and newer media logics. So Obama for America displayed this keen and largely neglected awareness of the continuing power of older media in election campaigns. But it also integrated this with its newer media strategy. It's not a case of either or, it's not only, but also. Also, elite investigative journalism is still important in these environments, as the revelations surrounding the failed Republican vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin demonstrated. Everybody remembers the viral circulation of Saturday Night Live comedic videos, but it was actually journalists at the Washington Post and the New York Times that were well ahead of the curve of the likes of Tina Fey and the celebrities on Saturday Night Live. It was their deep investigative studies of Alaskan politics that did the damage to Sarah Palin. And very briefly, turning to your neighbor country, Spain, with Podemos. This grew in part, of course, from social movement protest, the Indignados, the 15M. But what it's turned into is an interesting hybrid of part social movement, part online movement, part television-inspired movement, where Pablo Iglesias, the leader of Podemos, has ended up becoming something of a TV celebrity through his movement from the online world and the Indignados world to the world of mainstream television, such that now some of those who were involved in the Indignados movement are highly critical of this form of politics. But is it a recipe for success? I would argue yes, much more so than just solely online politics. And I move finally to talk about some recent research I've been doing, building upon my earlier research on WikiLeaks. There are surprising new journalism activism hybrids. The first of these that really fascinated me was the collaboration between WikiLeaks and the professional journalists at The Guardian and Le Monde and all of the other papers, the other 5 key papers that were involved in the big leaks, the mega leaks as they were known, of 2010. But it wasn't a case of either or. WikiLeaks had failed in its mission to be an online-only organization. It started to collaborate with professional elite journalists. The Guardian liked the idea very much so, and used the WikiLeaks data to great effect. But of course, bringing the story right up to date, there are equally surprising new forms of mass digital surveillance and censorship. Here's Edward Snowden, an iconic image from the front cover of Wired magazine. And here's perhaps a less pleasant image, Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, whose phone was famously tapped by the NSA. What's the story here? The story of surveillance and mass surveillance is profoundly depressing for anybody who cares about freedom, whether it's digital or not. But the story of journalism and the story of counterpower is quite interesting. What we've had with the Snowden leak and the rise to prominence, particularly of the Guardian newspaper, but also the Washington Post in the United States, both of these papers won the Pulitzer Prize, the most highly prized award in journalism. It was a partial rejection of the WikiLeaks model, because what they said was, we have our own source, we're going to control that source. This source is Edward Snowden. He's not like Julian Assange. We've learned from our experience. We've evolved and adapted through our practice in engaging with WikiLeaks and Assange. And instead, what we've done is we've called the shots. But that's not to say that they won't turn to online networks to energize and amplify their cause. The use, for instance, of Glenn Greenwald, the blogger who wasn't famous but is now famous, who eventually left The Guardian, founded his own online news outlet, The Intercept. This is a wonderful picture that I really love of Guardian editor, now former editor as of last week because he's retired, Alan Rusbridger, engaging in a Reddit chat. Very symbolic of the kind of dynamic I'm talking about, engaging with online activist circles in order to spread your professional journalism message. And this, again, is a slide that shows sources of the top tweets around Snowden when the stories were first revealed. You don't need to see the details. I'll just say a few things about what I'm talking about here as I close. Journalists are brilliant at crafting stories for maximum effect. They're also backed up by legal teams and expertise and knowledge and experience of the power of communication and persuasion. But online networks are particularly good at energizing and amplifying your cause and acting as advocates in literally spreading your message. So engagement with these online networks, for instance, in online chats, Twitter, question and answer sessions, including an extraordinary online chat with Edward Snowden when he was actually on the run from the United States authorities in an unknown location that was published live on The Guardian's website, generated over 6,000 comments. This kind of activity is civically valuable information. So in conclusion, I've just got one line. Civic capacity increasingly rests upon a hybrid mix of different media technology affordances, and that is my message. Thanks a lot for listening.
Are you going there? Jessica, stage is yours.
Right. I think I'm going to have my slides up. Okay, that's great. Yes, I'm going to borrow some of the categories that Andrew threw in his presentation, which is these hybrids of the different logics. But I'm going to move the debate from old to new media and talk about old politics and new politics. And the center of my presentation is going to be the relations between technology and democracy, and what we mean by democracy today. I want to move beyond the binary narrative. So on one side, we have the techno-solutionist utopian vision, for instance, conveyed by Silicon Valley, that tells us that through technology we can solve everything, or in politics that technology will disrupt policy, and instead of policymakers in parliaments, we will have AI instead of politicians, and that's going to be the end of it. But on the other side, we usually have the kind of dystopian view, and when we talk about digital democracy or digital government, we are still in front of the digital panopticon and the surveillance private-public partnership. And so I will try to move beyond and convey a sense of hope, looking at what can be the politics of the 21st century and how we can use technology to reinvigorate and change politics. Of course, I want to make sure that we understand that when we are talking about technology, we are not only talking about software, gadget, and hardware, but we are really talking about the new institutions of the 21st century. So new political forms, new model of organizations, new economic models, and even the new welfare state. So what really matters here in the context of politics is not so much what the technology can do, but what are the new forms of organization. And so I would argue the important thing is what is democracy in the 21st century and how we do build the new democratic institutions that are more open, that are more experimental, and that are in particular open to tap into the collective intelligence of society and citizens. And I would say young people in particular, have been feeling very disenfranchised and demotivated by the current politics, and they've lost trust in the political system. So the new generation of digital natives, which on the other side is inspired by the potential of the internet and digital networks, and there's been a lot of fights, for instance, against corruption in the political system and for transparency, they want to change politics, and they feel trapped by the lack of legitimacy of the political institution, in particular here after the financial crisis and with all the problems we have been hearing about unemployment, in particular in the youth. We do have a gap that needs to be filled by the new politics. So I will bring some examples of the project I run at Nesta, which is called Decentralized Citizen Engagement Technology. And we work across Europe, working with social movements and organizations that have revolutionized democracy in the last year. And we are building the next generation democratic infrastructures together with them. So I want to bring some of the examples, and our CEO at Nesta, for instance, he has predicted that in 2015, democracy was going to be reliving online, and as Andrew was saying, we have predicted it many times and it never happened, but now we do see the seeds of what we think is really changing the political game. So one example we have been very close to is Podemos and what we've been calling the rise of the network parties. I think a very interesting element in how Podemos is organized is how not only they break with the traditional 20th century categories of politics, which is left-wing and right-wing, and we talk about the bottom-up, the people, and Elo de Arriba, which is the elite, and they argue for devolving power to the citizens. But also the way they hybrid, so they're organized, they have networks of groups organized by citizens on the ground, which are the circulars, which are activating and mobilizing, and then they have a political party which has a more traditional party structure, and they have debates online with 1,000 people every day debating. They do all the voting online, and they have citizen initiatives so that their members can propose things to the parties that get discussed at the higher level. And we're seeing, of course, they mix the ethos of the 15M social movements, but they are now managing to verticalize that in what it looks very promising in the Spanish politics. They now lead in the polls, and they also won the local elections with the coalition. For instance, in Barcelona, we have a new mayor that's a citizen activist coming from the housing movement, and now is the new mayor of Barcelona. The five-star movement in Italy is similar. They use online direct democracy. They vote a lot of things online through the members, and they have a system that goes in parallel. When they discuss things in the parliament, they also get the members to comment on laws, to propose laws, and so they have all these parallel activities. They even define themselves not a party, but a citizen movement. Something else which is very interesting we'll be working on maybe one of the most important experiences in Europe is the Icelandic constitution. So in Iceland, they rewrote the constitution after the financial crisis, involving the public in writing the constitution, with a mix of a committee of voting members, but also input from the public online. And then it was voted through a referendum, but then the new government came in power and they didn't accept the constitution. So this shows you that at the end of the day, you need to take in consideration that the power is still with the elected representative. Then we have a great experiments here with new mechanisms for real democracies, which are the citizen initiatives. In Finland, there was an amendment to the Finnish constitution, and citizens can collect 50,000 signatures, and they can present a collaborative right law that gets voted to the parliament. And the Open Ministry, an organization we work with, they've been involved in the copyright legislation and the same-sex marriage law, and they've been successfully accepted in Parliament. Then we have seen very interesting, I think, in the way that citizens participated in politics, the constitutional reforms. I mean, we had the Irish example of the same-sex marriage referendum. We had, of course, the Scottish independence referendum that was not successful, but that gathered a lot of political participation. And before that, in Italy, we had an example of a constitutional reform to stop the privatization of water and make it a common good that was successful. And so we see this as really rising of something new. I want to mention also something more in the economic justice, which is participatory budgeting. So we see the spreading of participatory budgeting in cities at the state level. For instance, this is the example of Iceland in Reykjavik, where over 2 million euros are devoted to citizen projects, so citizens can participate in policy at city level and put their projects to be funded with public money. And in Paris, they devoted 20 million euros to participatory budgeting. We have experience, of course, historically coming from Brazil, where participatory budgeting was invented, and in many other cities across the world. Then it was mentioned before, when we talk about justice and the fight against secrecy and corruption, of course, the work of WikiLeaks also spur a lot of different initiatives and citizen-led initiatives against corruption. For instance, the HSBC leaks that denounce the tax evasion, or in Spain, there is a lot of different examples of citizen initiatives that are putting an end to corruption in the public sphere. Just coming back to my original question around the relationship between politics and technology and democracy, I want to mention this initiative, which is the online Magna Carta, which is a democratic response to mass surveillance that has been initiated by Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the web, which is also part of the Dissent project. And what is argued is that if we want to foster these kind of initiatives, which are really devolving power to the citizens and re-energize democracy, what we need to do is to have open, free, surveillance-free public infrastructures that are that can enable this kind of alternatives to rise, and that have at the center really social rights. So what we do with Dissent is building alternatives that decentralize the current power structures. And I think really when we talk about technologies for real democracy, there are two main things, and with this I want to end. The first thing is that we want open surveillance-free infrastructure for democracy, and that we need to shift from a securitarian mode to a more collaborative one. In particular, the public has a big role to play here. And then the other question, which has been at the center of the debate today as well, is the politics of data. So it is very important when we have infrastructures that continuously produce data that we say no to the digital panopticon, so that citizens have control over their personal and social data. This is a very political thing. And so this technology have to have the data ownership to the citizens, data portability, and cryptography as basic rights. And I think we may need, as Tim Berners-Lee say, a new Bill of Rights to make sure that technology can serve the purpose of real democracy today.
Thank you very much, Francesca. Very good fun. And yes, you do have to speak.
Thank you very much, and it was very interesting to listen to the two previous presentations. So when I started conceiving what I would go and share with you today, I thought that was important to bring a dimension that was not very much brought so far. We talked about social networks, about data generated, we talked about the civic movements, politicians, journalists, etc. But I thought, what is going to happen in 5 years from now? And we are developing at European level and at global level this fifth generation mobile and fixed networks. When we talk to the industry, they are talking about bringing together 7 billion of people, but more important than that, bringing 7 trillion of objects. And it puts a very different spin on what we've been discussing. Because in fact, the humans don't talk just with humans, don't talk with the society. You know, they sense the environment around themselves. Now, obviously, it's very important that from a perspective of a research or the production of this new generation of infrastructures will be much faster in terms of access speed, that we have quick reactions, and hopefully that we look to the sustainability as well, and that our systems will be green. But this first slide is really to say that the Internet of the future is not necessarily just an Internet of people, but mostly an Internet of things. Now, in this context, by the fantastic figures that I just mentioned, 7 billion, 7 trillion, we obviously are in the domain of a hyper-connected society. That will bring completely different notions that have been already somehow decrypted here in terms of what is on life, what is offline and online worlds. How does the human feel his own limits? How, in fact, the new actors or the new polarities will emerge in our society. And then obviously going to the aspects of data and probably digital social innovation and probably collective awareness, collective intelligence, and so on and so on. We could obviously discuss much more implications of this hyper-connected society. Let me just take from the very beginning this notion that in fact we have been used to live in the offline world, you know, a world of nature, of artifacts. They were related to each other and we could relate to them. And probably when we look to the future, sometimes we have this tendency to think about it as, you know, a continuation of what we have always seen, except that some years ago we started with the online world. But sometimes we may still think that the online world is relatively independent and complementary to the offline world. Now, I don't think that this is going to be the truth, because in fact what is going to happen in the future is that we'll enter in this on-life notion where virtuality and reality will be dramatically changing this relation with each other, where humans and artifacts and actually the nature will be completely changed, where we go, for example, in terms of data from scarcity to full abundance, or where individuals as entities will be very much affected by the interactions that we have with other individuals and the environment around us. And this morning we had already discussions about, you know, all the traceability of our movements in general, and the ability, for example, the right to be forgotten, for example. In fact, in this environment, you know, there is a lot of things that will change and that we have to reconceptualize. Consumers that become prosumers, the new consumer paradigms, the prices that will be depending on, for example, profiling or on personal information that we can get, even the notion of identity or the notion of trust on the others, I mean, the online reputation, for example, new concepts that have to be developed. Obviously, we have a fantastic example with Andrew, for example, on the change of the journalist function in the world of today, where he goes more from a side of delivering content to probably mashing up, you know, bringing this aggregation, integration of various informations. And obviously, like I'm sure that Francesca will remind me necessarily, there is the aspects of sustainability, the aspects of social innovation, the behaviors of people in the online world. Are we going to empower the citizens? Maybe, but there is a number of things that will be dependent. For example, digital literacy, the knowledge that we have to you know, walk in this world, the digital competencies. And something that we said already throughout the day of today, and I fix my attention because it's particularly important, the interactions more than who we are, with whom we interact every time. So this history, almost like a lifelong logging that remains behind us, this digital memory that we leave behind us. So as I would like to say, when we go to this on-life work, the interactions are much more sticky, they stay with us, there is a traceability on them, and with these trillions of objects around us, we'll be able to interact in a different way with our environment. Now, this brings probably new limits when we were looking back into the Enlightenment era, into the age of reason. Maybe we're looking to who you are, who are we in this global world. So we're looking ahead to our sky as the limit. When we then come into last year, we very much worried about sustainability of our own planet. But now I think that we leave also a question that is very important. Who am I in the middle of this panoply of data? How can I have enough attention, brain attention, to all what surrounds me? Those are very important questions that I think will be with us for the future. Now, new actors, new priorities. We believe that the people will be more empowered. They will be able to share the knowledge, to share their own knowledge, to become more aware of the environment, and hopefully to be able to take then decisions that are better informed and more responsible. The platforms, and there was a debate today if the platforms are the ones that come from Silicon Valley or the ones that can be generated by small groups of active citizens. Doesn't matter. We believe that these new platforms that will facilitate social interaction, networking, and sometimes you don't need very complex platforms. We may need just very simple interactions, almost based in SMS and things like this, will allow us to exert influence and address shared problems. In some of the examples that were detailed here by both of my precedent colleagues, I think that were very enlightening in this respect. The digital social innovation, very important. There are these new ways of making. Again, some speakers before talked about what I would call the market of one, the ability that I have to build my own product, to customize it, to make it at my dimension, and even to manufacture it. The collaborative economy that we discussed already, the notions like Airbnb or blah, blah cars. The open access and open democracy was enough treated before in terms of the democracy of the system. But I would like to bring again and again this sort of dimensions. We have a lot of opportunities now to make our public administration to be more transparent. There is tools that allow us to monitor the activity of our parliamentarians, or to compare notes between what the parliamentarians say about the legal framework and what the citizens do. You gave the example of Iceland. It doesn't matter the end result. What is important is the process in which citizens have engaged. But we can change completely out of the open democracy and think, for example, about information about patients. How are we going to be treated? What is the impact of certain medicines or treatments in the hospital? Sharing this information among patients, is one real example that exists. And one that I like particularly is the Safecast, is the one after the Fukushima event, sad event of all the nuclear implications of a disaster like that one, where it's not anymore just working with data, but actually working with open hardware, and the citizens were invited to build their own sensors to detect, radioactive pollution, if I may say, and define these maps. And in a lot of cases, we have always the comparison between the official statistics information with the perception that the citizens may have. In Italy, we may look to what the coverage by mobile phones is according to the regulator and to the enterprise, the operators, and you can also see a map of how the citizens perceive the coverage by, in fact, being or not able to use their own telephones. So a world that is opened by this Internet of Things, by this these social networks, the open access is particularly important. I would say that open access brings a lot of new business models that I believe that are particularly open for youngsters, for new entrepreneurs. There was today, again, a reflection about what open access and the models that come from the other side of the Atlantic and encourage another entrepreneurship, and how much are we relating to the big enterprises. But let me give the example of Oporto. Just today, Oporto has the ambition to be an intelligent city, a smart city. This can be done only with the open data, making the data open for people. If entrepreneurs can combine social network data, information coming from sensors, they can create new services. Obviously, this makes stringent requirements in public authorities when we make, timetables of buses or trains or airports available. They have to be curated and maintained to make sure that, a new enterprise, a new startup can make a new service that, for example, goes a door-to-door service and to be reliable. But there is a panoply of opportunities open from that point of view. Open data is crucial, and I think that I find in a lot of mayors, including here in Portugal, not just an openness to the model, but a very good consciousness of the opportunities that is open for local ecosystems. Data is not just for purposes of, say, good of mankind. There's a very important aspect in the big data of shifting from the data-driven decision-making and using amounts of data to make sure that we improve the business. But also, when we talk about open data, as I said, this opportunity to lower the barriers for new entrants, and therefore creating new business models and a new structure of business in Europe or elsewhere. A last slide to say that particular attention is given by the European Commission to the collective intelligence, not just to the predefined top-down platforms, but actually to talk to the people in the ground, to the small group of people and activists, be it in the building, be it in the neighborhood, the ones that want to compare the prices, the consumption of energy, the ones that want to install new alternative solutions and need for that to exchange data amongst all of them. But all what we are saying here brings to me a real last question, that is the one that I think that remains, and is the one that has to be answered by anthropologists, sociologists, by actually academics. We are actually looking to an internet that is not anymore something like in the past. It's actually a living body, and what we need is to increase our ability to analyze it, to study it. In fact, we need to develop a new science, the internet science, to understand better all these challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So it's great that you stuck to the time, because we still have some time for questions. And I'm going to use another song, this time from Janet Jackson, yay, to bring up a question that, interestingly enough, was asked by one of the students by email. On one of her songs called Rhythm Nation, she says, "Things are getting worse. We have to make them better. It's time to give a damn. Let's work together. Come on now." And the question that we received by email is about, sorry, we just lost it. Where is it? Whether electronic devices and technology is really bringing us together or making us isolated, and whether we're forming opinions in isolation, or rather whether technology is allowing us to create and make our opinions together. And the question is for the three of you. So, Andrew, do you want to
Sure.
start?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, one of the interesting things about this field of study that I'm involved in is that, as I said in my talk, in the early days, there was this big obsession with bringing people together in online forums to engage with each other in, I suppose, very idealized, rational, reflective, supremely tolerant ways. And the idea that if we could only get beyond the politics, we can reach consensus. So This is inspired by a long, long history of political philosophy, going back all the way to the ancient Greeks, which talks about reaching consensus through deliberation. And in the early days, by which I mean really the late 1990s, early 2000s, this was seen as the end goal, if only we could produce an environment that was like this. And we still see to this day, and indeed Francesca spent some time in her talk very eloquently talking about examples of this kind of thing. But what really took us all by surprise is the huge takeoff in political uses of digital technology, which came on the back of what was then called Web 2.0 or Web 2.0, which was the rise of social media, or what's now known as social media, particularly Facebook, and then Twitter, and then all the rest of them like Instagram and in Flickr in the old days, but Flickr has kind of gone out of favor now because Instagram's come along, and it's another example of how quickly these things move. But one of the real problems is how do we come to terms with these environments which, on the one hand, have the tendency to create great emotional unity among people through the sharing of emotional resources in very, very rapid fashion. And by emotional resources, I mean simple slogans and framings and understandings that are fundamentally humanitarian. So if you think about the experience of the Arab Spring, for instance, whatever we think about the outcomes of those particular rebellions now, at the time, it was due to the sharing of emotionally charged social media content. Not due to, but this played a role in the overall set of ingredients that led to, in some cases, the ousting of, dictators who've been in charge for decades, as happened in Egypt, for instance. So you've got this tendency for emotional unity, which answers the question, the side of the question that talks about coming together. But at the same time, of course, what we know is two things about these environments. One is that the commercial and proprietary nature of these environments means that they often have individualized forms of expression and behavior built into them. And this isn't always conducive to collective action, because as Evgeny Morozov said very eloquently this morning in that session, these are not designed necessarily for collective outcomes. These are designed for monetization of individual forms of behavior that can then be sold to advertisers for a fee to generate profit for the firm. Now, I'm not saying that that is the end of the argument, far from it. And indeed, politics is a much more individualized business now than it was, say, 20, 30 years ago. Countries vary in their levels of, collective action in party organizations, for instance. But overall, if you look at trends in political behavior going back to the mid-1970s, we've seen a loosening, and this is where Francesca's talk was very, very interesting and very accurate in my view. We've seen a big loosening of the traditionally hierarchical structures of organizational forms in politics. So I'm not saying that just because collective action is difficult to achieve because of these individualized forms of behavior, that individualism in politics is necessarily a bad thing. People want to express their individual opinions and see themselves very much in terms of lifestyle politics now. They have a set of values that they wish to assert that go beyond the traditional big ideologies that dominated so much of politics from the late 19th century onwards, like socialism, for instance, or even, old-style conservatism. So, but the problem is, just finally on this question is of course fragmentation. And if we end up in an environment where the public sphere becomes, for whatever, we might not want to use that term, the public sphere, but let's just use it for now, where the public sphere becomes so fragmented due to the effects of individualized forms of political expression online, then we could be in trouble. And I think that one of the interesting things finally about this sphere is where, and this comes back to a point, and I've written this down because I love the use of this word that Francesca, she said that Podemos have verticalized the social movement model, the online social movement model. And I think that's fascinating because what they've done is that they've gone for the best of both worlds model. They've gone for the professionalization, the media savvy, and by media savvy I mean largely broadcast media, but they've also built upon the remnants of the social movement network that was the 15M Indignados. And I think for me, as a political scientist who's quite pragmatic and quite hard-headed about these things, but who nevertheless is quite optimistic, I think that's where the future lies. The future lies in, if you like, the verticalization of certain elements of what were previously horizontalist forms of communication in the interests of gaining power and achieving collective action. So I think that's the answer, but it's really difficult to achieve.
Yeah, let me just maybe add, Andrew has said a lot. I want to go back to a point, actually, that we were commenting before entering into the stage, and that reflects upon some of the things that have been discussed earlier. And Andrew told me, I felt a little bit alienated with all these talks about AI and robots and algorithmic future, where at the end you're sitting there and you feel you're not in control. You feel that you're not going to have the capacity and the power, the collective power, to decide what we want and what kind of future we are building in the present and how the future is going to look like. And so I think that actually it is politics that could be the answer to the question of what is collective and who decides on what is the center of political action. And I think that is going to be a democratic revolution that gets us there, and not the question if the communication is bringing people together or not. I mean, on that, I have to say a lot of the most amazing and impressive things we see with technology, they're never foreseen by the corporations or by even the individual that build these tools. So most of the time, they're used subversively or in a way that you cannot predict. And that's where something changes and makes a difference. So I think it's very hard to see it that way. And I think there is a bigger question, of course, on what kind of models, really, what kind of models are we building, and why are we using all this intelligence and all this power of technology and all this data. And I think for me, for instance, and I think also, I'm sure for a lot of the young people sitting here and a lot of citizens, it's more important to know, are we going to have, what kind of jobs are we going to do in the future? It should be up to society to decide it and not to some kind of technological trajectory. And at the same point, it's going to be a matter of politics to decide if the young generation is going to be in the precariat forever, so without having any security and ability to construct the future in the way you want or not. So this is not technology. These are socio-economic political choices, and that's why we have politics, society, and that's what we need to debate. So I don't believe there is one trajectory. And I want to also add one thing about trust, which I think is very important. And most of the time, we talk about trust as some kind of also intrinsic property of technology. Of course, you can build trust in the system and make sure, for instance, that we have technologies that don't give all this power to corporations, that we have technology that are encrypted, and we have education that allow people to understand what's happening in the background, who is selling your data to whom and for what reason. But I think the fundamental thing to understand is that people are losing trust in the system. And this is what we need to change, and this is why I think what I showed, for instance, about Podemos or other movements, they are the hope. Why? Because you can see the wide-scale, large-scale participation of society in debating about what kind of schools do we want, what kind of welfare system do we want, what kind of work do we want, what is the priorities for politics, is maybe giving housing to everyone, or as Mario saying, migration. So these are the key issues, and this is why we want to be a society and have all these systems and future institutions in place.
Mario, do you allow me? We have 1 minute and a half. Let me quickly change the question, but, well, tying in with
I will still answer the other one.
I was going to ask you, in terms of these things that we're talking about and mobilizing the citizens and getting them as groups, we get very excited about the numbers of citizens engaged. But what is the real impact? What should we be measuring? Because 1,000 people making a like or going on the street doesn't make an impact necessarily. So how are we measuring those things? And how is the Commission measuring those things as well?
I think that actually you find this impact when you talk about a local level, for example. We sometimes go into big politics and countries and European-wide, and obviously when we put in place a digital single market, we are looking to the different legal frameworks and try to avoid fragmentation to make sure that data can flow from one side to the other, etc. But I'm particularly attentive on the local level, I mean, and we are talking about our own data for other people to do something. But there is the other side of the coin. I need my administration to give me all the data that they have for me to make sense of me, of my own interests, or the interests of the collectivity. And this is the public administration, but it's the private as well. When you know, we have the energy or the transports, I mean, we need to have this information available to be able to make more sense out of our own society and how we integrate with each other. So the sense of belonging to something also goes from these small signs. Those relate in particular to one very fundamental question, that is data ownership. To whom belongs the data? Or data liability. I mean, what is the implication of the misuse of the data? If I'm driving my car, if it is reasonably updated, I'm generating a lot of data, and in the future much more data. So this data can be to protect me or to be used against me. So liability, ownership, the intervention of the public authorities to help in the protection of the key data for us is very fundamental. Now, our data is going to be given. There is always here a certain contradiction in our behavior as a person. When we start discussing those topics, we are all for privacy, for, scared about what others can do with the data, and then in practice we give much more data than probably we should. But apart from this, oxymoron, I mean, what is important is that we can give data, but we have the right to have data from our public authorities, either to create new services or for the society to be able to be aware of the surroundings and that we can define collectively a better future for us.
Thank you, Mario. It was a pleasure having you. A shame that we don't have time for more questions. We started with 3 tags on screen from each one of you. Allow me to share 3 tags that I took from your conversation here today. And I took On Life from Mario. I took Hybrid Media, of course, from Andrew, and Democratic Revolution from Francesca. I don't know if it sums it up, but I think we have plenty of things to think about. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you.